Communication is at the heart of everything that happens in the workplace. How people learn information, ask questions, express perspectives and expectations, and generally socialize with each other. There's an endless amount of information that we could discuss related to communication in the workplace. In this video, we're going to cover the basic definition, process, and types of communication, strategies for active listening to improve communication, and then how to adapt communication to maximize its effectiveness based on factors like personality, relational styles, and culture. And without further ado, let's dive in. First, what is communication in the first place, and how does it affect work? Communication is the process of exchanging information. Technically, communication is the sending of information, while comprehension is the receiving of that information, but more broadly, communication is the interchange of information. Communication can take place one-on-one, in small groups, or with large audiences, in person or online. It can be spoken or written, verbal or nonverbal, expressed directly or indirectly, and it's often a combination of all of these. The ideal style of communication varies based on its purpose, the setting, the size of the group, and a variety of individual factors, like the personalities of the individuals involved, their relational styles, and cultural influences, all of which will be discussed in this video. Let's look at some of the elements of communication. Verbal communication, of course, uses language as the main means of communication, which can be written or spoken. Nonverbal communication, on the other hand, is the use of facial expressions, posture, gaze, gestures, etc., that express information without using language. Direct communication typically refers to the use of words and sometimes nonverbal behaviors to explicitly express ideas, such as saying, "I don't want to do that task." The good thing about direct communication is that people are more likely to be on the same page about the message. There's less likelihood of misunderstanding, jumping to conclusions, etc., but higher risk of upsetting, scaring, or offending someone. Indirect communication can also be verbal, but is often nonverbal, and requires things like body language and other context clues to determine the real meaning of the message. For example, rolling your eyes, sighing, taking a very long pause, or looking away from the speaker are all ways of indirectly communicating that you don't want to do that task without saying so. The good thing about indirect communication is that it's less likely to strike someone as offensive, erratic, or surprising, but that's at the expense of potentially not having your message as accurately received. If the receiver is used to direct communication, they also might feel that the person's being suspiciously evasive. This is particularly true if the person uses sarcasm as a form of indirectness, that is, saying one thing but communicating it in a way that means another, like, "Oh sure, I want to do that task." Even though we cannot hear people in the picture speaking, we can make assumptions about them based on their body language. The presenter in the left image appears to be confident in the delivery of their message, and the people around the table appear to be engaged, interested, and respectful. The people in the right image appear to have close relationships based on their physical distance to each other, and the conversation comes across as though it might be private. It's not particularly inviting to passerbys, as they've chosen to close their circle for the most part. You can see from these sample images that we communicate a lot without words, and we're not even consciously intentional about a lot of our language and communication. The general process of communication in organizational settings can be summarized in 3 steps that create an endless cycle of sending information, the true definition of communicating, receiving that information, technically comprehension, and then the response to that information, which can be thought of as feedback. That feedback invites more communication, and so on and so forth. When it comes to good feedback, timeliness is important, but you also need to consider the setting and your mental emotional state. Feedback is typically best delivered in private, when you're calm and level-headed, and as close in time to when the issue occurred as possible, as long as it's private and you're calm and level-headed. Communication is often misunderstood, especially at work when we don't tend to know people as well as we do in our personal lives. So we use a lot of context clues to help clarify meaning, including body language, as was discussed on the last slide. What we think we know about the person delivering the information is another major factor that's taken into consideration when determining the meaning of a communication. If you think that person is rude to begin with, you'll filter their words and behaviors through that lens. On the other hand, if you think they're wonderfully kind, you're likely to interpret that offhand comment as accidental rather than purposeful. People don't like feeling unheard, invalidated, convinced, or manipulated. And it's important to approach conversations with humility and openness to other perspectives. There are many ways to improve communication and reduce the likelihood of poor outcomes, such as treating people with respect, focusing on facts rather than judgments, and approaching conversations with the humility of knowing that you could be wrong or misinformed. Another strategy for improving your communication style is developing your listening skills. Active listening is one way to improve communication and relationships at work and everywhere else in your life. What many of us do when receiving information is either to passively listen, that is, somewhat mindlessly listening but not paying full attention or really putting effort into grasping what is being shared, or perhaps even worse, only listening to respond. If we want to have good quality communication, it's essential that everyone actively listens and responds thoughtfully to each other's messages. Active listening requires that we pay full, undivided attention to the speaker, or writer, but I'm going to focus on spoken communication here. We must engage in behaviors that demonstrate that we're fully listening, such as making eye contact, leaning a bit forward in your seat, not doing anything else at the same time, and nodding, smiling, saying short affirmative comments like yes, go on, ah, etc. when it's appropriate. While listening, it's important that your goal is to understand the intention of the communication. What is the other person actually trying to tell you? Are their words consistent with their body language? It's also important to be open-minded, even, and perhaps especially, when what they're saying feels upsetting in some way, maybe because their perspective clashes with yours or they're communicating critical feedback that you don't want to hear. Next, when the person is finished sharing their thoughts, it's your turn to further demonstrate that you were really listening by paraphrasing or summarizing what you heard in your own words. Not just parroting back what they said, but really demonstrating that you heard the meaning of their message. It's not just repeating, but showing that what they said mattered to you and that you listened intently because they mattered to you too. This not only communicates that you were listening, but communicates acknowledgement and validation to the person who shared the message and gives them an opportunity to further clarify any misunderstandings. They should feel heard. Asking questions can be really helpful. Is this what you mean? And am I understanding it correctly that you'd like ... Would you mind giving me a little bit more detail about ... What changes do you think would be helpful for solving this problem? You may have rebuttals to some of their points, and that's fair to share at some point, but resist the temptation to interrupt with them. Your time for sharing your perspective comes after they're done sharing theirs. When you do, make sure it's communicated respectfully and kindly. Empathy goes a very long way in improving interpersonal relationships and thus communication effectiveness. A simple, "I'm sorry that you've been having a hard experience with that, let's identify some solutions to put in place," can be massively impactful and supportive. If it makes sense, you might also consider adding a piece of information to show that you know the person and have been listening previously as well, such as, "I remember you sharing that this happened at your past position. Is this similar in that way?" Active listening will improve communication and also trust and honesty within relationships. If you want to have long-term relationships with coworkers and have positive working experiences with everyone, it's essential that they feel that they can speak to you without unwelcomed or unhelpful interruptions. It also helps promote effective conflict resolution, which is a powerful skill in the workplace. So active listening can be super helpful for minimizing interpersonal conflict and enhancing overall effectiveness of communication. Another helpful strategy is learning about people and understanding the ways in which we are not only similar, but also uniquely different. As mentioned earlier, different personality traits, relational styles, and cultural backgrounds can greatly affect how we communicate information to others and how we receive that communication too. We've already looked at personality in the workplace in a different video, so let's briefly look at how the big 5 traits affect communication. Appreciating and respecting people's varying personalities might involve being more understanding of someone who finds change more difficult, that is, a person who is relatively low in openness to experience. You might communicate to them in a more factual style rather than using as many creative, abstract analogies and other flowery strategies of communicating. Highly conscientious people may be more sensitive to critical feedback. because they are often perfectionists who are quite hard on themselves already. So making space for that disappointment and balancing the critical aspects with positive feedback can be powerfully beneficial. Extroverts tend to perceive introverts as insecure, anxious, and potentially even disengaged, when none of those should be assumed. Introverts, unlike extroverts, do tend to be quieter and prefer quieter environments, but that's not the same thing as feeling anxious, worried, or insecure, nor is it the same as being disengaged. Introverts can be very engaged, they just show it differently. They're also more likely to feel overwhelmed by someone delivering a message in a loud, direct manner, and they don't like to be put on the spot. So communicating with them would be improved by calm delivery and time for reflection before giving input. Introverted people often do better when given time to think before responding, whereas more extroverted people are typically more comfortable diving in and having louder, more engaged conversations with multiple stakeholders at once. People high in agreeableness also are more sensitive to critical feedback and anything that might signal a potential rupture in a relationship. By definition, they care about how they impact people and they want to be liked. Lastly, neuroticism can also affect communication. Someone who is more prone to stress, anxiety, and vulnerability will benefit from a communication style that is more supportive and sensitive compared to someone who is low in neuroticism and may prefer a very direct, straightforward style of communication. Similarly, people higher in neuroticism may need to take time to calm down before delivering and/or responding to challenging interpersonal situations. Keep in mind, as we covered earlier in the course, that personality traits do not determine behavior. They influence behavior. But ultimately, we are in control of how we act. This is important to remember when communicating with people because it places the emphasis on the context rather than the person's characteristics. That was communicated in a rude fashion is a much more fair form of feedback than "you're a rude person," unless you have a great deal of evidence for the latter. Another factor that influences communication is a person's relational style, which is essentially adult attachment styles that play out in our workplace relationships and our methods of sending and receiving communication. Before I talk about communication and relational style specifically, though, I want to run through what these terms mean. And if you've taken my personality course, this chart should look familiar. There are 4 main attachment styles, though they are each spectrums to an extent. Secure attachment is considered the ideal, so to speak, as it involves being high in proximity seeking, that is, wanting to engage with others, and low in abandonment anxiety, that is, not particularly worried about abandonment. As children, their environments were likely stable, loving, and safe, which taught them that people are generally good and that they are worthy of love and care. Quick but important side note, you don't have to be raised in a secure environment to develop secure attachments, but it is easier that way. In fact, you can be securely attached in some relationships, but not all. For example, your family of origin may not feel safe and loving, but your relationship with your partner might. Okay, so securely attached people tend to be trusting and have stable relationships that are open, but also respectful of boundaries. Anxious attachment is also high in proximity seeking. So these people too want to engage with others and desire meaningful relationships. But unlike those with secure attachments, those who are anxiously attached have much higher abandonment anxiety, and they worry quite a bit about people leaving, rejecting, or hurting them. In light of this, they tend to be reassurance-seeking and more likely to seemingly overreact to information that signals a potential problem. They come across as more worried and potentially more needy. Their childhoods are often characterized by inconsistencies in care, which teaches them that they need to be louder and more exaggerative to get their needs met consistently. Because they view themselves negatively, they are more likely to depend on others and to worry about people leaving them. Avoidantly attached people are basically the opposite of anxiously attached folks. They are low in proximity seeking and do not generally want deep relationships with others. And at the same time, they're low in abandonment anxiety because they don't expect you to stay and they don't believe they need you. They come across as more detached, reclusive, and, surprise, surprise, avoidant. They're the people you describe as having trust issues because they don't open up as easily and they don't necessarily want you to open up to them either. Their childhoods are usually cold, rejecting, and detached too, which teaches them that they're basically on their own and that people are more or less useless to them. Disorganized attachment is, unfortunately, a mix of the challenges of anxious and avoidant. It's thankfully the least common of the 4 and is generally a result of a traumatic upbringing. Since it's a mix of anxious and avoidant, I won't cover it specifically in this video. Before I move on, I want to note that since we're talking about workplace communication, we can't assume that we know people's working models of themselves or others, or definitively know their attachment style. But on the other hand, in workplace environments where we spend 40-ish hours each week with our colleagues, we do get to know them fairly well, and there are helpful signs to look out for in order to determine how we should vary our communication style to better suit their relational preferences. According to Leader et al. 2015, securely attached adults have more positive working models of themselves and others, are more comfortable in relationships, have higher self-efficacy in terms of managing stress, are more confident that other people will support them when needed, and overall tend to be more physically and mentally healthy. Signs of relational security include strong bonds with colleagues, resilience to stress and critical feedback, and overall stability in relationships. In terms of communication at work, relationally secure people have the easiest time. They're more likely to give others the benefit of the doubt, they more easily come across as self-assured, and they're generally well-liked by their peers and by management. If they receive critical feedback, they're the most likely to view it as constructive, helpful, and doable. They tend to be approach-oriented and want to solve problems effectively and collaboratively, and to view it as an opportunity for growth. Delivery of communication, therefore, can be direct and straightforward. Sessa et al. 2020 explored the relationship between attachment style and communication style. They found that securely attached people were the most resilient to being given so-called unpleasant news related to a low score on a computer game. This should make sense because securely attached people are the least vulnerable to the fear of failure. They view themselves as worthy and lovable regardless of how others see them, which actually strengthens their ability to create bonds with colleagues. Having less fear of rejection than relationally anxious people, but more than relationally avoidant people, places relationally secure people right in the middle. They can form strong bonds, care about what other people think about them to a degree, but also demonstrate resilience when given tough feedback. Anxious attachment reflects a negative model of the self, which prompts significant relational anxiety. These individuals do not inherently feel worthy or lovable, and instead view other people positively. They are prone to ruminating and to taking critiques more personally than they're often intended to be. According to Leader et al., at work, they are more likely to feel judged, criticized, and rejected, and that can serve as a barrier to effective participation on a team, particularly in light of the self-fulfilling prophecy that can occur relationally. The hypersensitivity to rejection prompts a compulsive need for closeness that backfires and prompts distance seeking from others, which only reinforces their perception of unworthiness, rejection, and abandonment. Signs of relational anxiety include overall hypervigilance about relationships and a tendency to catastrophize and overthink. These individuals take critical feedback the hardest and also engage in the most reassurance-seeking behavior of the three styles. Of course, they're not going to always look like they're feeling overwhelmed because they aren't. They're just more prone to relational stress and more likely to be sensitive to any information that signals a threat to the relationship. People with high relational anxiety are more likely to feel threatened by critical feedback. It's a sign that their peers or managers don't like them, don't see their value, or think that they're failing. They are prone to hyperfixating on their perceived flaws and to jumping to conclusions about how others view them. They generally have lower self-esteem, especially social self-esteem, and are more likely to overthink the meaning behind the communication being delivered, even when it's delivered at face value. They also put a lot of effort into their relationships and really want to be liked and appreciated by everyone. They benefit from a communication style that is sensitive, gentle, and reassuring. Communication that balances any critical or constructive feedback with information that reduces the risk that they feel rejected or at risk of losing the relationship. Keep in mind that they tend to have extremely high, oftentimes unreasonable expectations for themselves and a tendency toward feeling underappreciated. So they're hyper aware of the feedback they get from others and are often harder on themselves than anyone else is. It's also helpful to include some positive comments about their abilities, character, performance, etc., so it's clear that you value their work and what they bring to the role. Which shouldn't be difficult, because while these individuals are more sensitive and vigilant in their relationships, they're also highly motivated to be liked by everyone and to do their best in the role, in part to receive the resulting appreciation and relational security. Because of their hyperactivated nervous system, sensitivity to critical feedback, and a tendency to overwork to fit in and please everyone around them, they are particularly at risk of burnout. With that said, they're also great employees in many ways. They put in tremendous effort to get along with everyone and to do their best work, always aiming to improve and grow. In their study, Sessa et al. Found that anxiously attached individuals with higher need for approval from others were the most likely to engage in reticent and mitigated communication styles, including reassuring other participants, evading having to give upsetting news, emphasizing the difficulty of the game played as part of the experimental design, and a general tendency to underestimate their own abilities. The researchers suggest these were all aimed at protecting the other players, which reduces their relational anxiety, but at the expense of openness and honesty. Those who received news that they did not perform well in the game also expressed the highest embarrassment about their score, which plays on their already low self-confidence and fears of disapproval from others. Avoidant attachment reflects a negative model of others, which prompts avoidance of close relationships and of relying on other people. They feel the need to protect themselves against others, and do so by valuing their independence, autonomy, and invulnerability to pain caused by other people. According to Leader et al., adults with avoidant attachment styles do not easily trust or depend on other people. They keep emotional distance, which then reduces their actual support, which reinforces their working model of people being unavailable and untrustworthy. They also tend to use work as an excuse for avoiding social interactions in their personal lives. Relationally avoidant people tend to come across as disengaged. This is a coping skill they've learned throughout their lives to keep them safe. With that said, they can also be quite good at masking their avoidance and may actually be the center of attention at times. This is particularly true if they use humor to maintain relational distance. Humor is popular, people like it, and tend to like the person who delivers it, assuming it's their brand of humor. But humor serves another purpose that is more subtle. It keeps the conversation from getting too emotional, too intimate, too personal. Relationally avoidant people may prefer to work alone, though that's not always the case. Again, relational avoidance is more about distance in terms of relational closeness than it is about physical proximity. An extroverted person with avoidant tendencies may nonetheless be quite social, as long as that sociality is superficial. They can also be quite oppositional in the face of authority and leadership, which can be helpful in some contexts and harmful in others. As the least likely to conform to the group, their resistance to the pull of popularity and approval can be an amazing asset in many fields and positions, just as we discussed earlier in the course about people who score low in the trait of agreeableness. Groups need at least one person who's willing to point out problems, express areas of concern, and push back against problematic policies and initiatives. The avoidants among us are the most comfortable doing just that. They are independent workers, and they're also least distracted by interpersonal issues, both ones at work and in their personal lives. They tend to minimize distress from critical feedback by distancing themselves from sources of threat or rejection, and by convincing themselves that they don't care. They tend to be self-sufficient and want to be in control, which can come across as aloof and standoffish, or as the class clown. They benefit from problem-focused conversation, factual, logical, and solution-oriented. Rather than diving into too much emotional depth, or requiring them to provide emotional reassurance or connection, communication needs to minimize any form of emotional intimacy, and that shouldn't threaten their sense of independence or autonomy. In the Sessa et al. Study, avoidantly attached people were the most likely to deliver communication frankly. Frankness in this sense is aimed at delivering the news honestly, which at times can make the displeasing news seem even worse, like for example by delivering someone's failure as, "You sucked," an actual quoted response from the study. It makes sense that it's the most common amongst those who are avoidantly attached, as they're the least concerned with the impact of delivering unpleasant news, since they place the lowest value on the relationship, and being frank actually helps to maintain relational distance. You don't like me? Fine. I don't like you either. As a peer and manager, it's easier to adapt to other people's relational styles when you yourself are secure. In fact, secure relationships are generally the easiest to maintain, as both approach the other with trust and care, which becomes a positive, self-fulfilling prophecy. Communication, of course, is the easiest in these dynamics because both parties are resilient, self-assured, and relationally confident. The worst combination, and therefore the one that requires the most adaptation, is a relationally anxious person interacting with an avoidant one. The need for closeness and reassurance in the relationally anxious person is a trigger to the avoidant one, which prompts them to pull away even more, which of course only amplifies the neediness. In these cases, the relationally anxious person needs to work on self-soothing and taking criticism as grounds for growth rather than a personal attack, And the relationally avoidant person needs to work on being consistent and predictable, and acting as though they care about their colleagues, even if deep down they don't so much. Two relationally anxious people will generally act sensitively because they know what it's like to be the other. Two relationally avoidant people also have an okay time together because neither will put emotional demands on the other, and thus everyone easily maintains their distance. Culture impacts communication on many levels and is the last factor we'll look at in this video. Culture doesn't just refer to location, which at this point is often multinational anyway, but even those organizations that are located in a singular region need to be mindful of the diversity of their workforce. The cultural attitudes, norms, etc. aren't just influenced by the actual setting of an organization, or even where each employee is from, but their cultural heritage as well. Communication can be adapted to cultural frameworks, and when it is, the effectiveness of that communication is greatly improved. Erin Meyer, author of the Culture Map, lays out 8 scales, all of which can affect communication. Communicating, of course, is very directly about, communicating, and refers to high versus low context styles of communication. The US is an extremely low context culture compared to many Asian cultures, for example, like Japanese culture. American culture is considered a low context culture because we're fairly direct communicators and thus do not rely as much on context to determine meaning. We tend to say what we mean at face value and perceive good quality communication as precise, explicit, simple, clear, and fact-based. In contrast, Japanese culture, for example, is high context, and thus much more reading between the lines. If you ask a group of Americans if they have any questions, they will raise their hands to indicate that they do, if they don't just blurt it out. In Japan, they're more likely to subtly shift eye contact toward the speaker, which indicates that they'd like to be called upon to ask a question. Much more subtle, nuanced, and implied rather than directly stated. American speakers also tend to use more simple language that's less bureaucratic and aristocratic in nature, but they balance it out with heavier use of visual and colorful language to make points. Evaluating is how we give feedback, specifically negative feedback, whether that's directly, indirectly, or in the case of US culture, somewhere in the middle. If you've ever learned about the sandwich method of feedback, which is predominantly taught in the United States, this should come as no surprise. We're taught to sandwich that constructive feedback with positive feedback at the beginning and end. Russia and the Netherlands are on the direct side of the spectrum, while Japan, Thailand, and Indonesia are on the indirect end. Persuading is how we persuade others, particularly the types of arguments that work best. The US is strongly application first, which means we start with the facts or opinions and then discuss the details, add examples, and draw conclusions. Philosophical and theoretical arguments are not considered to be appropriate or relevant in business settings. The other side is concept first persuasion, which starts with the theory or concepts and ends with the facts or opinions. This reflects the tendency to value the conceptual principle over the exact facts or opinions. Leading has to do with how hierarchical or egalitarian an organization is, with US culture falling somewhere in the middle compared to many Asian cultures, which are much more hierarchical, albeit also more respectful. The most egalitarian, that is, least hierarchical cultures are many of the Northern European ones, including Denmark, Netherlands, and Sweden. In these cultures, organizational structures are flatter, and bosses are expected to treat everyone as equals. The more hierarchical are Japan, Korea, and Nigeria. They view the ideal boss as strong and leading from the front, with his status and fixed layers of hierarchy. Deciding is how organizations make decisions, with consensual on one end, meaning that everyone is included in decision-making, and top-down on the other hand, which is just like it sounds, when decisions are made at the top and delivered down from there. Interestingly, Japanese culture tends to be hierarchical, but also consensual. They tend to seek consensus from the lower levels first, and only then bring proposals up the rings of the ladder. The most top-down culture is Nigerian, followed by Chinese. Trusting is about how trust is built, with the US being a strongly task-based culture rather than relationship-based, like many Asian and Middle Eastern countries. One factor that influences the American task-based culture is a strong judicial system in which contracts enforce much of what happens in organizational settings. You don't have to trust your boss having good intentions so long as you trust that your contract will protect you. We develop trust through our work behaviors. Do good work, show up reliably, people will trust you. Relationship-based cultures include Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, China, and India. In these cultures, building trust involves spending time together, including meals, drinks, and other outside-of-work engagements. Disagreeing is how people approach or avoid confrontation, with the US being between these poles, meaning that disagreement can be open and viewed positively, but can also be seen as inappropriate, a threat to relationships, and viewed negatively. French culture is known to have more positive view toward open confrontation. Debate is encouraged and not considered to be a reflection of the relationship. The most avoidant of confrontation are Indonesia, Japan, and Thailand. In these cultures, it will negatively impact the relationship and it's harmful to the overall harmony of the group. Lastly, scheduling refers to how people view time, whether that's linear, like the US, or more flexibly, like Nigeria, Kenya, and India. Linear time is associated with sequences and finishing a task before starting another. Flexible time is more fluid. Interruptions are more acceptable, and adaptability is valued.